Yeah, g'day folks. Just Ben Little from the Aquaculture Centre down here in Broome. Just wanting to talk about, I guess, some possible workplace scenarios in the aquaculture industry so that we're focusing on, improving our processes. So it's just important that we remember that it's everybody's responsibility for safety on any work site. So you walk into a work site, you see something that's not safe, you report it or you try and fix it yourself if you've got the means to do that. In the process of doing that, we kind of say think safe, think SAM, and SAM stands for spot the hazard, assess the risk, make or manage a change, and that's within the level of your experience or within the level of your skill. You're not going to go and try and fix something electrically um, that you're obviously not qualified to do. All right, you want to stop work if you think it's unsafe. There's no problem in saying, hey, tools down, we need to have a look and see how that we can do this safe or how we can replace a tool that might have become unsafe in the process of using it, so on and so forth. We also want to make sure that any hazards, accidents or incidents are reported, and that goes for potential hazards. So anything that you perceive that may cause an injury at some stage or some sort of other risk, we need to address that before it actually becomes a problem. Ultimately, you need to keep a lookout for yourself at all times and other workers in the area. So just keeping an eye on your workmates. If you see that, say for instance, old mate's using an angle grinder or whatever, and he's dragged his cable through a puddle of water, you can just go and turn it off at the power point and just say, hey mate, your power cord's in some water. Just little things like that. Just keep an eye out for people other than just yourself as well. And also just be aware that other people, other than yourself, I guess you should say, that you're going to see things a little bit differently. So just be tolerant of others' ideas. Have a listen because they might have something really valid or responsible to say. So realistically, the word idea is important because an idea is a way to improve. So I just want to go through some hazards attached to a few different scenarios that might exist within the industry. And here we have a guy who's obviously lifted quite a heavy container up to sort of chest height. He's got it leaning on the edge of what we call a polar circle or a fish pen, and he's feeding some fish by hand with a hand scoop. All right, now this is actually an Australian one, and it's really important that in Australia we have really strict rules. Other industries in other areas around the world might have less strict rules, but in Australia, like for instance, old mate down here is not wearing any shoes. Obviously the container that he has lifted just here, the orange container, is going to be quite heavy, so there's obviously a hazard there, a physical hazard of lifting that may cause a back injury or a shoulder injury or a wrist injury, things like that. He's got short sleeves, short pants, no hat. He's got sunnies on. That's a good thing. He's protecting his eyes. And if he hasn't got sunscreen on, he's at risk of getting sunburnt. We can't see anybody else in the boat. I mean, there's a boat all the way back here. It's quite a long way away. But say if old mate here has he faints because he's hot, he hasn't been drinking, he's got sunburn, he's got heat stroke, whatever it might be, he falls into the water and he passes out, he's got no life jacket on. So we've got an issue there with him maybe drowning. So the hazard is not having the life jacket on, and then the risk is him possibly drowning, as the hazard is not having any long sleeves, long pants, or a hat or sunscreen on, and the hazard is the sun, and the issue that it's going to cause is severe sunburn potentially. Even the act of him feeding the way he is feeding will cause potential long-term shoulder, elbow, and wrist injuries, something we call repetitive strain injury, and that needs to be addressed as well. Pretty simple scenario, not one that many of us would come up with in the aquaculture industry unless we're in the process of processing fish. But the fish themselves, these barra, they've obviously got spines along their back, along their ventral fins down here, and they've got quite sharp spines along the back of their gill cover or their operculum. So we've got an issue with maybe having a physical injury or a cut or an abrasion or whatever it might be from the spines or the gill plates itself. We've obviously got a knife here, which to me doesn't really resemble the sort of knife that we should really be using to fillet a fish. It actually looks a little bit worn out. It's possibly blunt. And a blunt knife is actually a lot worse to use than a sharp knife because you have to use a lot more pressure on it to actually get it to go through the flesh. So we risk snapping the blade, slipping the blade through and cutting our hand or our arm or a vein even in your wrist. So I've seen that done before. So realistically, we just got to be thinking about how we manage this fish. He's got it on a non-slip mat, which is actually a pretty good idea. But that non-slip mat would have to have a rinse down every now and again with barramundi because they're quite slimy. So after every few fish, we would want to give that a quick rinse down. Probably doesn't need to be dried off because the mat itself would probably still be okay when it's wet. It just needs to have the slime removed from it. So in this situation, we could be improving the knife that is used. We could rinse the mat down to avoid the hazard of slipping there. Not slipping over, but the fish slipping and then not having a grip on the fish and maybe slicing your hand, because that's the real risk in this one. And alternatively, the guy that's filleting his fish could have a chain mail mesh on his left hand, the one that he's going to use to hold the fish down. A chain mail mesh is just like a gauntlet glove that can't be cut through. It's pretty common for us in the industry to play with chemicals, a range of chemicals. In this situation, it's a set of chemicals that are set up to do a titration for probably something like alkalinity, maybe pH, ammonia, things like that. It's really important that obviously we check the labels. The labels on here aren't visible at all, but there will be labels and SDS sheets attached to each of these chemicals to say, hey, if you get it in your eyes, you do this. Don't drink it. If you do drink it, do this. So on and so forth. So the risk with these is actually a chemical hazard. And each one of these is likely to have some sort of different problem with it. I'm going to say problem. And each of those would have to be managed independently of each other, so to speak. So realistically, if we're handling chemicals, we could handle them, if they're really dangerous chemicals, we could handle them in a fume hood. It's like a massive extractor fan that removes the vapors from the atmosphere immediately in front of us. We could use something like a vapor respirator. We could use them in a heavily ventilated area. Basically, don't use them in an enclosed area if we don't have to. But other than that, realistically, the chemical hazards, the safety data sheets that come with them, will be the defining factor in how you manage the hazards attached to those particular chemicals. Alright, so it's pretty common for us. We saw the guy back in the very first scenario, he was feeding fish by hand. For us to avoid the manual handling hazards, like I said, he's going to throw that feed out day after day. He's eventually going to hurt his shoulder, his neck, his back, his arm, his elbow, his wrist. And then you're going to have a work cover compo claim. He might not be able to do his job possibly forever again, maybe, who knows. So to avoid that as a potential hazard, we replace the physical manual handling hazard, so to speak, or the risks attached to that, by using a mechanical piece of equipment that removes the need to throw the food. And this one here is a blower. So we load this hopper up with, just hazard a guess, probably 100 to 200 kilos of food. There's a little valve down here that rotates as the motor spins. Normally, it's what we call an auger or a delivery valve. Over here, it's just like a 4 horsepower petrol or diesel motor that runs a big fan. It's down here, a battery obviously. The fan just blows the air through the pipe, and as the dosing valve runs, it just drops food in and we can spray it out like as if we're watering the lawn. Now, it's obvious that through quite a fair bit of friction and with that hot air running through and the food, it's quite likely that this nozzle on the end is going to get hot. So I think what they've done to avoid that is to put a handle back here so that they can manage the arc of the feeding spread or the feeding pattern without having to touch the end. If you didn't have this, you could use a set of gloves, or you could manufacture something to avoid getting burnt. The fan itself and the motor, they run quite loud, so to avoid that, we obviously want to make sure that we're wearing earmuffs, things like that. And again, it's probably not such a bad one, but the risk of getting feed dust in your eyes and getting an infection is reasonably moderate. So, back in the day when I fed out at Cone Bay, we had similar situations where we would have to feed into the wind on rough days, things like that. And if it was a really dusty food, you'd end up covered in it. You'd end up within your eyes, and people got styes, um, serious eye infections, things like that. So we got to the point where we were making people wear at least a set of sunglasses to prevent the dust from getting their eyes. But primarily, we'd be looking at the PPE would probably be gloves, ear muffs, and glasses. That's probably the easiest way to get around it. Other than that, there's not a lot of pinch points or anything down here in the motor. They're largely protected, but beware of other machines that may not be very well protected, because they might have pinching points where you could maybe get your fingers stuck. You might even lose a finger, things like that. And then there's a very minor electrical hazard here that could cause a fire through the 12-volt battery system, but very limited other than that. So that's the end of our show, and the end of the presentation. And really, what we want to get out of this is, if you're not sure about any of the process, make sure you get an induction or an orientation to it. The induction is the most important thing that will show you how someone wants to do it. It will have a procedure attached to it, generally speaking. So just make sure that you put your hand up and say, I actually don't know how to do that. I wouldn't mind having an induction on that. Stay aware of all your hazards and risks. Don't just turn a blind eye to things, or just go, I think I might hurt myself if I do that, but I'm going to keep doing it. Just stop it. Just don't go down that track. Obviously, keep an eye on what's immediately happening in front of you. Try not to get too, I know I've just said keep an eye out for the hazards and the risks, but keep an eye on the work that is being done right in front of you, because that's more likely where you might hurt yourself. Keep a lookout for others. Report anything that doesn't look right, and that might be a visual report, it might be an email, it could be a memo, it could be a diary entry, or it could be something like an electronic reporting system where you can email it to your managers or to your occupational health and safety committee, those sorts of things. And ultimately stop work if you have to. So in our next presentation, I'm just going to walk through how we can use the hierarchy of control to manage some of the hazards in relation to, how we can manage the risks attached to some of those hazards that we've just gone through in some of those scenarios. So stay tuned, and we'll have a look at trying to make it a little bit easier for you to understand.